And here we go. We're now going to look at the growth of bones. There's actually a separate process called bone remodeling that we will deal with in the next video. But here, let's look at bone growth. We'll start with just how bones form, and will be a very, very basic introduction to that. We'll look at how bones grow both longer and wider, and how and why do bones stop growing. We'll look at those here. So first, let's skip the details of bone formation if that's okay with you. Bone formation actually varies a little bit based upon the type of bone, so we won't get too involved with this. I do want to show you this though. Um, all of our bone well, all of our skeleton rather, as a fetus initially starts off as hyaline cartilage. And what you're seeing in this view is you're seeing how the red actually represents bone, but these spaces here, what appear to be spaces, the pinkish areas, are actually cartilage. Those are areas that have not ossified yet. We start off again with a skeleton that's completely hyaline cartilage. We gradually ossify parts of it, but even when we're born with more than 270 bones. Some people will say even 300 bones. Gradually, bones will continue to fuse as cartilage is replaced, as we ossify the bone, ossify the cartilage rather into bone, and eventually we end up at 206. So bone fusion does occur. That's an important process. But again, we're not going to delve into the formation of bony tissue, except to say that we start off as cartilage models that eventually see ossification of our cartilage into bone. Instead, we'll focus a little more on the factors that affect bone growth and then look at the two major kinds of bone growth. What influences our bone growth? Most importantly, from infancy up until puberty, the most important thing that influences our bone growth is human growth hormone. This is a hormone produced by the anterior pituitary in our brain, and it actually stimulates IGFs. IGFs stand for insulin growth factors, or insulin-like rather. Sorry, insulin-like growth factors. And what this term refers to is there are proteins that make cells take up sugars that may make them more active, make them more metabolically active. In this case, HGH makes or stimulates IGFs, which actually stimulate mitosis of cells to produce bone growth. So a lack of HGH is going to result in stunted growth. And we see this in some forms of dwarfism, where they just don't produce HGH, and therefore they will not develop to a normal height because of the lack of these factors. At puberty, probably the most important influence is going to be from sex steroids, hormones that we associate with puberty. Estrogen and androgens, testosterone, are going to kick in and influence skeletal growth even more at that point. All of us, male and female, produce some estrogen, but females produce clearly a lot more, and they produce it relatively early in puberty, so they start to see bone development occur faster. And if you've ever been to the 8th grade dance, you've seen this. The girls are taller than the boys. Eventually, the boys catch up. The girls actually stop growing first. Too much estrogen, or high levels of estrogen, actually stop bone growth, so that we see the females will stop and the males will continue beyond. Estrogen also influences differential bone growth. For example, we associate certain differences in male and female skeletons, like females have on average wider hips. Their skeletons are not quite as robust. Male skeletons tend to be thicker, for example, and those are differences that we associate with the sex steroids. Other factors that influence bone growth include adequate minerals. Obviously, there must be calcium and phosphorus, which make up part of the matrix that we associate with bone. And some vitamins, in particular vitamins A, C, and D. Vitamin A is actually going to be important to influence osteoblasts to be active. When osteoblasts are active, of course, that's going to produce more bone. Vitamin C we associate with collagen production. Vitamin C is going to be necessary to make the collagen fibers that we also associate with the bony matrix. And vitamin D is necessary for us to absorb calcium from the intestines. We need calcium, going back to having adequate minerals, to make sure the bones have adequate hardness. And then we've already mentioned IGFs. So all these are factors that influence bone growth. There's going to be some other things too we'll mention, including even physical stress on the skeleton, that we will deal more with the bone remodeling. Okay, so moving on to the two different kinds of bone growth. Uh, Obviously, when you were born, you're larger now than you used to be. Why? Well, your bones grew both in length and in thickness. So how did that occur? There's two different kinds of growth, and we'll focus on the lengthening of bones first. And of course, we're focusing on long bones. It's a little different process that you would see in flat bones or irregular bones or short bones. So let's focus on the long bones first. The simple version of this is that newer cells are going to be produced in the metaphysis in one part of the long bone, and the older cells are going to calcify on the diaphysis or on the shaft end. So once again, we're talking about what occurs right in here. And you may recognize this region of the long bone as representing or being part of the growth plate. So what happens in the growth plate? What you see in the growth plate, what a growth plate is, let's start with that, are regions of cartilage. And notice we have a resting region, a multiplying region, a maturing region, and a calcified region. And we should recognize again that all of these regions are going to be hyaline cartilage. So this is the cartilage that we associate with a growth plate. Of course, also we have hyaline cartilage as the articular cartilage, but we're not focusing on that for right now. So at the growth plate then, we're going to have these different kinds of cartilages, and we'll see in subsequent slides what happens here. Essentially what happens is we're going to produce more cells, and then we're going to push the epiphysis end away from the diaphysis end. If you want to, we're going to kind of insert a layer of new cells, which will cause the bone to elongate. So let's look at that process in a little more detail here. And let's consider these zones of cartilage. These are really important. There is and let's make sure we get our bearings. This is the epiphyseal side. So if you want to, this is the end. Now this is the end of the bone. Down here is the shaft end. So we'll kind of just draw it like this. So this is going to be the growth plate right stuck between, right in the epiphyseal, and the epiphyseal region represents the growth plate in this case. So there is a zone of resting cartilage. This is cartilage. It's not truly resting. It's just this is sort of the attachment part of the growth plate to the inside of the epiphyseal end of the bone. Then there's a zone of proliferation. We saw it labeled before as dividing cartilage. This is going to be where you have active mitosis. What you see in these regions, little cells, they look like little bitty coins stacked together, but these cells are going to be actively dividing, and again, producing a little bit of new cell growth. As you have some cells divide, they push, and some cells divide, they push, and creates an elongation mechanism. The hypertrophic zone is going to be where these new cells, these new cartilage cells, chondrocytes, cartilage cells, these new cartilage cells are going to be elongating and enlarging. So notice our little stacks of discs are now bigger, more obvious discs in here. They're elongating, and once again, they're pushing. The zone of calcification is the area where the osteoblasts are beginning to infiltrate this cartilage and beginning to lay down matrix. And again, the matrix represents calcium and phosphate and collagen. So this is now a region where it's becoming less about cartilage and more about bone. And then the ossified bone is part of the diaphyseal side, where we are getting the true bone. So here we are inserting new cartilage. The cartilage is growing. As the cartilage is in this region, we are beginning to calcify it. So that part of the growth plate is becoming calcified, and therefore no longer growing or mitotic. So The short version of all of this is we are inserting a new region, and that's causing the bone to elongate. You can see it even better perhaps on this slide. You can see the cell differences a little better. Let me move me over here. This resting zone is also called the quiescent zone. And again, this is where it's attaching to the epiphyseal end of the bone. Here's our growth or proliferation zone, actively producing cells. The newest cells here. The hypertrophic zone represents cells that are elongating. The calcification zone, where we're getting some osteoblast calcification, and we are seeing, you see osteoblasts here depositing their matrix, and then the ossification zone, where we have only osseous tissue, we have only bone here. So the more involved version really isn't that much more involved. It just gives you a little fuller explanation. The diaphysis lengthens, the shaft lengthens because the zone proliferating cartilage here and the maturation of cells causes that insertion of new tissue. Eventually that tissue will calcify and we will be done laying down new bone. So this then shows you, let me pull me out of the way here. This shows you, again, well, actually shows you both kinds of bone growth. When you see the term epiphyseal growth, that refers to the elongation. And you see the arrows here showing how the bone will be essentially pushed one direction as it lengthens. So cartilage is replaced by bone, and that's the process of elongation or epiphyseal growth. Growth in diameter is a process we'll talk about in just a second. That's a little different process, how we're going to add and take away bone. But before we leave elongation of bone, let's just look at this. Here we see the epiphyseal line. This is what used to be the growth plate, but now it is completely calcified, and now we're going to have no more bone growth. So as long as there is cartilage there, a growth plate, there can be elongation. When we get to this point where all we're seeing is bony calcified region, now the bone cannot get any longer. Someone who is 35 years old is not going to get taller because they're not going to have any more mitosis in that region. In fact, we associate for most people, females somewhere between about 18 and 22 have reached their maximum height because there's no more growth plate present. For males, it can go as late as into the early 20s, in 23, 24. But whenever we see, again, an epiphyseal line, that means there's no more possible growth of that long bone. Just to show you the difference, which of the hands here represents the younger child? And the hint is we're looking for regions where there is not any calcification. Said differently, where do we still see growth plates? And if we look here, there's my little arrows, my little indication. If you look here, for example, you can see regions where there's kind of quote-unquote holes or spaces. This is where you have cartilage, and an x-ray that's not going to show up as obviously bone tissue. So we see at the ends of these long bones, we're going to see these growth plates indicating this is the child's hand. This one is probably clearly an adult because we don't see, we see no growth plates in these long bones at all. We see the joints between the bones, but we don't see the spaces in the bones indicating there's growth plates present. So how do bones grow wider? What is this process of appositional growth? I gave you the complete verbiage here on the side, and I'm going to try to show you a video here in a second. But what happens, and this goes back to our discussion of the periosteal blood vessels, and we see a good example of one here. If you can imagine, and I'll try to follow the mouse here, if we could come around here, if we could just build bone tissue around these periosteal blood vessels, what do we essentially have? We'll have an osteon, because we'll have blood vessels inside of a bony tissue. So what essentially happens is ridges are going to fold and they're going to trap one of these periosteal blood vessels in a tunnel. The osteoblasts are going to start forming. They're going to start forming, again, my mouse here, they're going to start forming those concentric lamellae, those rings around the blood vessel, and then we're going to have a gradual decrease of bone tissue on the inside of the bone. We're going to have a process that we'll look at more in a second. We're going to take away bone here and add bone there. So bones can get heavier, and well, they can get thicker without getting a lot heavier. So we take away bone tissue on the inside, you can think of it that way, here in the endosteum, and we're going to add it here, and that's way we're going to have bone getting wider without getting a lot heavier. So this is just a walkthrough one more time of the same process. You can see it a little easier here. This is a periosteal blood vessel, and we're going to have these ridges develop, these osteoblasts begin to build bone across the gap and actually trap that blood vessel inside a tunnel. As we do that, then this appositional growth, that means the osteoblasts begin to then fill in the concentric lamellae around the blood vessel until eventually we have an osteon. Again, an osteon is going to contain what? It's going to have a Haversian canal with a blood vessel and nerves in it. We're going to see our concentric lamellae. So now we would have a complete osteon. I'm going to play this video. I'm going to try to get the volume so you can hear it. It's a good animation of the same process. Let's see if this works.
Bones grow through the process of appositional growth, the formation of new bone on the surface of older bone or cartilage. Osteoblasts beneath the periosteum lay down bone to form ridges around a blood vessel. The blood vessel lies in a groove between the ridges. The groove is transformed into a tunnel when the bone built on the adjacent ridges meets. The periosteum of the groove becomes the endosteum of the tunnel. Osteoblasts from the endosteum lay down bone to form a new concentric lamella. The production of additional concentric lamellae fills in the tunnel and completes the formation of a new osteon.
Okay, that will do it for this video, and we'll be looking at remodeling in the next one. Thanks.